A German test pilot bailated out over enemy territory in 1945, certain the Americans would torture him to death. Instead, they did something that would change his life forever and prove why America won more than just the war. This is the story of Hans Werner Lurch, and the moment one sergeant's decision rippled through the next 60 years. March 1945, Hans Werner Lurch's Messerschmitt was trailing black smoke over the Rye Valley. American fighters circled above him like wolves stalking wounded prey. He was 26 years old, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, and he was about to die in enemy territory. His hands shook on the control stick, not from fear of the crash but from what would come after. If he survived the bailout, he would face American soldiers, and Hans knew exactly what that meant. For years, Goebbels' propaganda machine had filled every German mind with nightmares about American captivity. He had heard the stories in pilot briefings and mess. Americans tortured prisoners for information. They murdered German pilots on sight, especially test pilots who knew too many secrets. Some stories claim they handed Luftwaffe prisoners over to the Russians, which was a death sentence. Other whispers spoke of prison camps where men starved, where guards beat you senseless for speaking German. Hans was not naive enough to believe all the propaganda, but he had seen what happened to shot down American pilots in Germany. Some Wehrmacht units still followed the rules, but others did not. And the SS, they had killed Allied airmen just for surviving their crashes. He had heard about it firsthand from Wehrmacht officers who were disgusted by such violations of military honor. Why would the Americans be any different? Why would they show mercy to an enemy pilot who had spent 4 years helping refine the weapons that killed their brothers? The altimeter spun down 2,000 ft 500. Through his shattered canopy, he could smell burning oil and hydraulic fluid mixing with the cold March air. The fighter that hit him was long gone, probably already radioing his position to ground forces. They would be waiting for him. 1,000 ft. Time to jump or die. Trying. Hans grabbed the canopy release with his left hand, his right fumbling with the harness. The metal was slick with his own blood. He had taken shrapnel in his shoulder when the first burst of .50 caliber rounds tore through his cockpit. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, warm blood soaking through his flight suit. He thought of his wife, Hildegard, and their daughter back in Bad Warischen. Would they even be told what happened to him? Or would he just disappear into some American camp? Another name on a list that never came home, 500 ft. The Bavarian countryside rushed up at him. Fields and forests he had flown over 1,000 times, now enemy territory. He pulled the release. The canopy tore away. Ice-cold wind blasted his face, stealing his breath. He hauled himself up against the G-forces and threw his body into the void. The parachute snapped open, jerking him hard enough to make him gasp in pain from his shoulder. Below, his Messers augured into a farmer's field in a shower of earth and twisted metal. Smoke billowed black against the blue spring sky. 4 years of test flying, hundreds of hours evaluating every fighter the Reich produced. And it ended here, drifting down into enemy hands with nothing but his flight suit and the knowledge in his head. Knowledge the Americans would torture out of him. He could see them now. Soldiers running across the field toward his landing spot, rifles raised, jeeps bouncing along dirt roads, kicking up dust. They would be on him in seconds. This was how it ended. Everything his superiors had warned him about was about to come true. But Hans Werner Lurch was about to discover something that would shatter everything he had been told about the enemy. And 30 years later, he would still be trying to understand in times repay times what happened in the next 60 seconds. Hans hit the ground hard, his injured shoulder exploding in white-hot pain. He collapsed into the dirt, tasting blood and earth, gasping. His parachute dragged him several meters across the muddy field before he managed to slap the quick release with his good hand. The silk deflated like a surrender flag. He lay there for a moment, trying to breathe through the pain. Above him, the sky was impossibly blue, peaceful, indifferent to the war being fought beneath it. He could hear boots pounding closer, American voices shouting words he could not quite make out over the ringing in his ears. This was it. The moment every German pilot dreaded. Hans forced himself to his knees. then his feet swaying. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the spring grass. He raised his right hand slowly, palm open, the universal gesture of surrender he had practiced in his mind 100 times, but never thought he would actually use. The American soldiers emerged from the tree, 5 or 6 of them, United States Army infantry, rifles trained on his chest. They were younger than he expected. Farm boys mostly, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion. The lead soldier, Hans, could see the sergeant stripes on his uniform, was shouting something, probably ordering him not to move. Hans's legs trembled beneath him. He kept his hand raised, trying to convey with his eyes that he was not a threat, that he was wounded, that he just wanted to survive the next 60 seconds. His mouth was too dry to speak. Even if he could find words, his English was terrible. He knew technical aviation terms, but little else. The sergeant approached cautiously, rifle leveled at Hans's head. Hans could see the man's finger on the trigger, see the calculation in his eyes. Another soldier circled behind him. Hans felt hands patting him down, roughly checking for weapons. They found nothing, just his blood-soaked flight suit and the iron cross pinned to his chest, which one soldier ripped off and pocketed without ceremony. Luftwaffe, the sergeant said, looking at Hans's wings insignia, then louder to his men. We got ourselves a Krutt pilot. Hans understood that much. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but only managed. I am. The words died in his throat. The world tilted at odd angles. The sergeant studied him for a long moment, taking in the blood, the power of his face, the way Hans swayed on his feet like a tree about to fall. Hans saw something shift in the American's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. One soldier seeing another soldier in trouble. Then the sergeant did something Hans never expected. He lowered his rifle. Get the medic, the sergeant called over his shoulder, his voice sharp with urgency. This one is hurt bad. A younger soldier, barely 20, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger, ran up with a canvas bag marked with a red cross. He dropped to one knee beside Hans, easing him down to sit in the grass with surprising gentleness. Hans wanted to protest, to explain he could stand, but his legs gave out and the world was starting to spin. Easy there, buddy, the medic said, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone who should hate him. He was already cutting away Hans's flight jacket with scissors, exposing the shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Damn, you got chewed up pretty good. Hans flinched as the medic probed the wound, but the American's touch was careful, almost tender, nothing like what he had expected. Where was the brutality? The interrogation, the rifle butt to his face, the revenge for all those American pilots shot down over Germany. Morphine, the medic asked the sergeant. Give it to him. He's no good to intel if he bleeds out. Hans felt the sting of a needle in his thigh, and within seconds the pain began to recede into a warm, distant fog. The medic was wrapping his shoulder now, talking to him in that soft voice, even though Hans could not understand most of the words. But the tone was like talking to an injured friend, not an enemy. You're going to be okay, Fritz, we'll get you patched up. The sergeant lit a cigarette, an American Lucky Strike, and to Hans's complete shock offered it to him. Hans took it with a shaking hand, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. It tasted like real tobacco instead of the airsoft garbage they had been smoking in Germany for 2 years. Actual tobacco. The sergeant even held his lighter for him, cupping his hand against the spring breeze like they were comrades sharing a break. What's your name, Kraut? The sergeant asked slowly, as if talking to a child. Hans managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Hans Werner Lurch. Well, Lurch, you picked a hell of a day to fall out of the sky. War's almost over anyway. You're lucky you ran into us instead of some of the boys who lost friends to your Luftwaffe. They might not have been so friendly. Hans understood maybe half of that, but he caught the essential message. He was lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. He had expected to be beaten or shot, and instead an American medic was bandaging his wounds, and a sergeant was sharing cigarettes like they were fellow soldiers instead of enemies. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Medic says we got to get him to the aid station. One of the soldiers called out. Load him in the jeep, the sergeant replied, already moving on to other concerns. treating Hans's capture as routine business rather than a moment for revenge. As they carried him across the field on a stretcher, Hans looked back at the burning wreckage of his Messerschmitt. 4 years of war condensed into twisted metal and smoke. He had survived dozens of test flights in experimental aircraft, dodged British Spitfires and American Thunderbolts, pushed prototype jets to their limits, and now it was over. He was alive, wounded but alive, in the hands of men who were supposed to be monsters. The jeep ride to the aid station was a blur of morphing and confusion. Hans drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation in English he could not follow, seeing flashes of devastated German countryside rolling past bombed-out buildings, burned tanks, the detritus of a lost war. At some point, someone gave him water, held the canteen to his lips like he was a child. Another impossible kindness. When he coughed and some spilled down his chin, the soldier just wiped it away and tilted the canteen more carefully. "Easy does it, Captain. Small sips." This was not what Goebbels had promised. This was not the American brutality he had been warned about since 1941. This was something else entirely, and Hans was about to discover it was only the beginning. Hans woke in a bed, not a cot on a concrete floor, not a pile of straw in some barn, an actual bed with clean white sheets that smelled of soap. His shoulder had been properly bandaged, the pain reduced to a dull, manageable ache. Sunlight streamed through a real glass window, and somewhere nearby, someone was playing American swing music on a phonograph. Glenn Miller, if he was not mistaken, he blinked, trying to orient himself. This was clearly a field hospital, but nothing like the nightmare scenarios he had imagined during the long years of war. The room was clean, organized, staffed by medical personnel who moved with calm efficiency rather than chaos. Other wounded soldiers occupied nearby beds. Some American, some German lying side by side. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was being beat. The Americans and Germans were receiving the same care. A nurse noticed he was awake. A woman in an American Army uniform with captain's bars on her collar. She approached with a clipboard and a professional smile that seemed genuine rather than forced. "Guten Morgen, Captain Lurch," she said in heavily accented but functional German. "I am Captain Morrison. How is the pain this morning?" Hans struggled to sit up, his mind still foggy. "You speak German?" "A little, enough to check on our patients." She examined his dressings with practiced hands, her touch professional but gentle. "You were lucky. The shrapnel missed the major vessels. You will have full use of your arm once it heals. 6 weeks, maybe 8. "I do not understand," Hans said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Why are you treating me? I am your enemy." Captain Morrison gave him a puzzled look, as if the question itself was strange. "Because you are wounded. That is what we do." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, as if there was no other possible response to a wounded human being. Over the next 3 days, Hans's confusion only deepened. The Americans fed him the same rations they gave their own wounded. Not bread and water, but hot meals with actual meat, vegetables, coffee with real cream, even chocolate bars. When he mentioned he was still hungry after one meal, they brought him more food without hesitation, without using it as leverage or demanding information in exchange. The medical care was meticulous. A surgeon came by daily to check his wound, changing dressings, watching for infection with the kind of careful attention Hans had not seen in German hospitals in years. They gave him penicillin, that miracle drug the Germans had heard about but rarely had access to. Pain medication came regularly on schedule, not withheld as punishment or leverage. But the biggest shock was how the American staff treated him. Not as an enemy, not even as a prisoner exactly, but as a patient who deserved care. The nurses asked about his comfort. Would he like another blanket? Was the light too bright? Did he need help getting to the latrine? The orderlies helped him wash, helped him dress without shame or cruelty or mockery. One young private, a kid from Iowa named Miller, with an open, friendly face, even tried to teach him English phrases during his rounds, laughing good-naturedly at Hans's terrible pronunciation. "No, no," Miller would say, grinning. "It's thank you, not thank you. You got to make the sound, see?" He would stick his tongue between his teeth to demonstrate, looking ridiculous but patient. Hans tried it, failed miserably, and Miller just laughed and patted his good shoulder. "We'll work on it, Captain. You've got time. War's almost over anyway." This casual friendship bewildered Hans most of all. Miller was 19, had probably lost friends to German fighters, had every reason to hate Luftwaffe pilots, yet here he was, treating Hans like a comrade instead of a murderer. Where was the hatred, the desire for revenge, the anger at what Germany had done? On his 4th day in the hospital, a United States Army Air Force officer arrived, a major named Patterson, maybe 40, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. He pulled up a chair beside Hans's bed, moving slowly, deliberately, like someone who had all the time in the world. He opened a folder filled with papers. "Captain Lurch," he said in perfect, unaccented German, "I understand you are a test pilot for the Luftwaffe, quite an experienced one from what we have gathered." Hans's heart sank. Here it comes, he thought. The interrogation, the pressure, the threats, the moment when the mask of kindness would fall away. "Yes, sir," he said carefully. "I was assigned to the Airpro Bungelen, the test centers." Patterson nodded, studying the papers. "The Reich's aircraft evaluation facilities. You've evaluated most of the Luftwaffe's fighters, I imagine. The Mi-262s, the jets, this was dangerous territory." Hans knew he had to be careful. "I flew many aircraft types, sir. It was my assignment. I'm sure you did." Patterson leaned back, his tone conversational rather than accusatory, like they were two colleagues discussing work. "Here's the thing, Captain. The war is almost over. Everyone with eyes can see it. Germany is finished. The question now isn't who wins, we know that answer. The question is what happens next. What happens to men like you?" Hans said nothing, waiting for the trap he was certain was coming. "We've captured a lot of your aircraft," Patterson continued, almost casual. "Jets, rocket planes, experimental designs, fascinating machines, but we need someone who understands these aircraft to help us evaluate them properly. Someone with real experience, not just technical manuals and guesswork." Hans stared at him, not quite believing what he was hearing. You want me to help you. I want you to do what you've always done. Fly and evaluate aircraft, except now you'd be doing it for us instead of the Luftwaffe." Patterson smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "The alternative is sitting in a P camp until the war officially ends, then getting shipped home to whatever's left of Germany. Your choice." It was not really a choice, and Patterson knew it, but what stunned Hans was the offer itself. The Americans were not torturing him. They were proposing a job. They were acknowledging his expertise. "Why would you trust me?" Hans asked, genuinely confused. "Who said anything about trust?" Patterson's smile widened. "You'll be watched. Armed guards, restricted areas, but we need your skills. And frankly, Captain, you've got nowhere else to go." Hans thought about Hildegard and his daughter, thought about the ruins of Germany, then thought about what he loved most, flying. The Americans were offering him a chance to keep doing what he was born to do. "I will help you," he said quietly. Patterson stood and offered his hand. Hans shook it, feeling the surreal nature of the moment. A Luftwaffe test pilot shaking hands with an American major, not his enemies but his colleagues. "Welcome aboard," Captain Patterson said. "Let's get that shoulder healed up. We've got a lot of aircraft for you to evaluate." The Americans moved Hans to a more secure facility near Frankfurt within a week, but secure turned out to mean something very different than he had imagined. Yes, there were guards and fences and checkpoints, but his quarters were comfortable. The food remained good, and the Americans treated him with consistent professional respect that never wavered. The base commander, Colonel Raymond, was a pragmatist who had flown P-47 Thunderbolts in combat over France. He invited Hans to dinner his first night at the new facility, serving pot roast and potatoes while asking detailed questions about Luftwaffe training methods. Not interrogation, genuine professional curiosity. "Our boys are good pilots," Raymond said, cutting his meat with precise movements. "But your Luftwaffe gave us hell for years. I lost 2 wingmen to Bf-109s over France in '44. Good men. What made your training program so effective in the early years?" Hans hesitated, unsure if this was a trap, a trick to make him reveal secrets. But Raymond's face showed only professional interest. one aviator talking to another about the craft they both understood. "We had time," Hans said carefully, still testing the waters. "Early in the war, before everything fell apart, we could train pilots properly. Hundreds of hours of flight time by the end." He shrugged with his good shoulder. "We were sending boys up with 50 hours. They died in days, sometimes hours." Raymond nodded grimly, his expression darkening. "Same story everywhere. War grinds men up faster than you can train them. Doesn't matter which side you're on." He poured Hans a glass of wine. Actual wine, not the rot gut that had been available in Germany for years. "Here's to the poor bastards who didn't make it. Ours and yours." They drank to the dead. Hans felt tears prick his eyes, unexpected emotion welling up from somewhere deep. This American colonel had lost friends to German guns, had every reason to hate him. Yet here he sat, sharing wine with the Luftwaffe pilot, acknowledging the common humanity of loss. Over the following weeks, Hans met the team he would be working with: American test pilots, engineers, intelligence officers. They were initially wary, which he understood and even respected. But as they worked together, examining captured German aircraft, discussing design philosophies and performance characteristics, something unexpected happened. They became colleagues. There was Captain Jake Larson, a P-51 Mustang pilot who had shot down 4 German fighters over the Rhine. He and Hans spent hours comparing notes on the Bf-109 versus the Mustang, debating the merits of different armaments and engine configurations. Their conversation started stiffly, professionally distant, but soon became animated. Even heated, two professionals dissecting the tools of their trade with the passion of men who understood what it meant to trust your life to a machine at 20,000 FT. "Your 109 turns better than my Mustang at low altitude," Elson admitted one afternoon as they examined a captured Gustav model in the hangar. "But above 20,000 FT, we owned you. You couldn't touch us up there." The supercharger, Hans agreed, running his hand along the 109's wing. "We never solved that problem properly, and your range, my God, you could fly to Berlin and back. We would run out of fuel after an hour of combat." Larson grinned. "That's what happens when you've got Packard Merlin engines and drop tanks. Though I'll admit, first time I saw a Me-262 jet scream past me, I nearly messed myself. You bastards in your jets almost changed everything." The casual profanity, the easy camaraderie, it felt impossible. They should hate each other. Instead, they were swapping pilot stories like old academy classmates, finding common ground in the shared experience of combat flying. The real breakthrough came when Hans first flew a captured P-51 Mustang. The Americans had one painted in Luftwaffe colors for evaluation, and they asked Hans to put it through its paces. Standing beside the aircraft, this beautiful American fighter that had terrorized German airspace for 2 years, Hans felt a complex mix of emotions churning in his chest: respect for the machine's elegant design, bitterness at what it had done to his comrades, and underneath it all, the pilot's pure childlike desire to fly something new. "She's all yours, Captain," Major Patterson said, gesturing to the cockpit like a man offering a gift. "Take her up and tell us what you think." No nonsense, just your honest, professional assessment. Hans climbed into the cockpit. The seat fit him perfectly. Americans and Germans weren't so different in size. After all, the instruments were logically arranged, easier to read than the cramped German equivalents. He went through the pre-flight checklist with an American engineer, translating when necessary, patient as Hans asked questions. Then he fired up the Packard Merlin engine. The sound was incredible. A deep, powerful roar that vibrated through the airframe, thrumming in his chest. German engines had their own music, their own character. But this was something else entirely. This was American industrial might condensed into 12 cylinders of raw power. Hans taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and opened the throttle. The Mustang leaped forward like a thoroughbred released from the gate. The acceleration was ***, brutal, violent, ***, pinning him back in his seat harder than any German fighter ever had. He was airborne in seconds, climbing at a rate that made him laugh out loud despite himself, despite everything. Good God, this thing could climb. For the next 40 minutes, Hans forgot the war, forgot his wounded shoulder, forgot being a prisoner. He just flew. He pushed the Mustang through every maneuver he knew. Loops, rolls, high-speed dives, tight turns that pulled G-forces until his vision tunneled. He tested the stall characteristics, the control response, the incredible visibility from the bubble canopy. Magnificent. So much better than the claustrophobic 109 cockpit. He even attempted some combat maneuvers, imagining how he would have fought against his former comrades in this machine. It was exhilarating and sobering. This was what they had been up against. This was why Germany lost the air war. When he landed, Patterson and Larsen were waiting on the tarmac, eager for his assessment. "Well," Patterson asked, "what do you think?" Hans climbed out of the cockpit, his face flushed with the pure joy of flight, his heart still racing. "It is a beautiful machine," he said. "Honestly, superior to the Bf-109 in almost every measurable way. The visibility, the range, the engine power at high altitude. It is remarkable, truly remarkable engineering." "What about weaknesses?" Larsen pressed, curious. "Every aircraft has them. The roll rate at very high speed could be better," Hans said thoughtfully. "And the ammunition load is lighter than I'd prefer for ground attack missions. But as a pure fighter, as an air superiority platform," he shook his head admiringly, "in the hands of a good pilot, it is devastating. We knew this, of course. We felt it every day in the sky, but actually flying one." He paused, searching for words in his limited English. "Now I understand why we lost." It was a moment of brutal honesty. These Americans had given him the chance to fly their finest fighter, and he had responded with unvarnished truth instead of pride. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. He was not just a prisoner helping his captors. He was a test pilot doing what test pilots do, evaluating aircraft objectively without national bias. Over dinner that night in the officers' mess, the walls came down even further. Larsen produced a photo of his girlfriend back in Michigan, showing it around with obvious pride. "Sarah," he said softly, "we're getting married when I get home. If I get home on time, she's already threatening to start without me." The other pilots laughed. Another pilot, Lieutenant Morrison, pulled out pictures of his two kids. "Jenny's 7 now, Tommy's 5. Haven't seen them in 18 months. They probably won't even recognize me." Hans felt in his flight suit pocket they had returned his personal effects after initial processing and pulled out his own creased photograph. Hildegard, holding their 3-year-old daughter, both smiling at the camera on some sunny day that felt like another lifetime. "My family," he said simply, his voice thick. The Americans passed it around the table, looking at the photo with the same tenderness they had shown their own. No sneers, no mockery, no jokes about the enemy, just men recognizing that the enemy pilot also had people waiting for him. "Beautiful wife," Morrison said quietly. "Your daughter looks just like her." "She is 3, Hans said, struggling with the English words. She will not remember me if I am gone too long." "You'll get back to them," Elsan said firmly. "War's almost done. They're already processing prisoners for repatriation. You'll be home before you know it, telling her stories about the crazy Americans you met." Hans wanted to believe that with every fiber of his being, but more than the promise of home, what struck him most was the compassion in these men's voices. They were not guards and prisoner, not victors and vanquished. They were fathers and husbands, pilots and professionals, understanding each other's fears and hopes across the divide of nationality. That night, lying in his bunk, Hans tried to process everything. Every day brought new proof that the propaganda had been lies. The Americans were not monsters. They were professionals who took their jobs seriously, but never forgot their humanity. They followed rules even when it would have been easier not to. They showed respect to an enemy pilot who had helped kill their friends, not because they were weak, but because they believed in something larger than revenge. This was not mercy born of weakness. This was discipline, conviction, strength. Hans began to question everything he had been told. Not just about the war, but about what it meant to have honor. Maybe Germany hadn't lost just to American machines. Maybe they had lost to American values. Values that said a wounded enemy deserved care, that a prisoner deserved food, that a test pilot deserved the chance to keep flying. The Americans were showing him something more powerful than any weapon. The possibility that there was a better way to be human, and Hans Werner lurched shot down over the Rhine, and expecting death was beginning to believe it. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Hans heard the news in the officers' mess at the base near Frankfurt, surrounded by American pilots who cheered, embraced, and wept with relief. They had survived. The war in Europe was over. Hans sat quietly at his table, processing what this meant. Germany had been completely defeated. His nation lay in ruins. Everything he had fought for had been for nothing, or worse than nothing, given what was now coming to light about the camps, the atrocities, the systematic murder that had been happening while he flew his test missions. But his work with the Americans continued. If anything, it accelerated. With the war officially over, restrictions eased. Hans evaluated dozens of captured German aircraft over the following months. Not just fighters, but experimental designs, rocket planes, and jets that had never entered production. His reports were detailed, honest, and invaluable to American engineers trying to understand how German aviation had advanced even in the chaos of defeat. More than technical data, Hans provided context. He explained the design philosophies, the resource constraints, the desperate gambles taken as Germany's situation deteriorated. He told them which projects had been genuinely promising and which were propaganda fantasies, last-ditch hopes with no basis in reality. Then in August, just 3 months after surrender, Major Patterson came to him with a proposal that seemed impossible.